Thank you very much. Actually, it's either a distinguished record or I can't hold a job. And so there was a period of time I said I'd been a corporate lawyer, an investment banker, and a New York City politician. I just needed to do real estate, and then I would have been in every sleazy profession you could actually be in. But I have had the opportunity, and I actually liked all of those jobs, frankly. But I have had the opportunity over the last, like 20 years or so, 20 plus years now, to work in international work. And so I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be part of this series on development. I must say, I'm at home in New York. I've been a member for a long time. Hardly ever go to events, but I've been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm just forever thinking to myself, will they have any sessions on development? Because they so seldom do, although they've started having some on health. We now have to convince them to do some on education. So I'll talk a little bit about education. I am not an education specialist. As I said, I went the wrong way. I became a lawyer. My brother actually moved into the education field, so he knows a lot more than I do. I am presently the chair of the Global Partnership for Education, which is a multilateral organization involved in supporting the education plans in the poorest countries in the world, and particularly focused on the effect of those plans in getting children into school, particularly into primary and early secondary school, and hopefully supporting them to get a good education. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's when I say it's multilateral, its governance is made up of donor countries, including Ireland, developing countries, representation from civil society, representation from international organizations, the World Bank and UNICEF and UNESCO, teachers, and also now we have representation from the private sector and private foundations. So let me talk, assuming this is a group that knows something about development, I'll use a little development speak. So I'm going to start off about the importance of education and in the context of the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, just as a start. And I'm building on what you just said. First of all, education, there's no single silver bullet, if you will, in development, but I do believe that education really does lift and has the potential for lifting people out of poverty. Just to give you some figures, each year schooling translates into a 10% increase in an individual's potential income. So just to start with Millennium Development Goal 1, which is reducing and bringing people out of poverty. In terms of Millennium Development Goal 2, that is actually the education goal that all children will have access to and complete primary school, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Millennium Development Goal 3 has to do with gender, and I think it's pretty well known, again, the multiplier effect of educating girls. I mean, education is a right, and it's a right for all children. It's a right, it's built into human rights conventions, it's built into the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but the multiplier effect of girls getting an education in terms of that girl growing to be an adult, more likely to be a healthy adult, her children less likely to die before the age of 5. That under 5 mortality rate is a very important indicator both of poverty and caring for children. That's another Millennium Development Goal, by the way. That's Goal 4. So education saves the lives of children. We know that a girl who's been educated, not only basic education, but into secondary school, more able to make choices about her life, so she's better able to space the birth of her children. They are, again, more likely to live, more likely to be healthy. She's less likely to be a victim of HIV and AIDS. There are no absolutes in this, but the multiplier effect is quite something. Millennium Development Goal 5 is about maternal health. And again, education plays a critical role there in terms of, as I just mentioned before, particularly, again, the education of girls, but improving the quality of life for women, not just as bearers of children, but as human beings, and human beings who can make choices. So if you go through all of the Millennium Development Goals, certainly education is a key foundation for the success of achieving those goals. If I have any complaint about the Millennium, well, I have two complaints about the Millennium Development Goals, frankly. One, that they are they were created in a very stovepipe way. And as we are racing toward 2015, which is the year we're supposed to achieve all of these goals, we're now into my MDG is more important than your MDG, and I think that's not very useful. And frankly, the reason I started out the way I started is I wanted to remind that education really flows through all of them, and it isn't health is more important than education. They're actually very related. The child who's immunized but has no opportunity to go to school isn't very well off. The child who has an opportunity to go to school but arrives with malnourished or with worms or whatever the case may be isn't going to succeed very well either. So that's my one complaint. The other complaint is, frankly, I think that the education goal is a very narrow goal. So let me now talk generally around education and the importance of education development. I think it's fair to say that for the last 20 years or so, the primary focus in terms of education and development has been around access. And I think it's also correct to say it probably was a correct focus. It was all around getting children into school. And if you think that back in 2000, when, for example, again, back to the MDGs, but even before 2000, when it was estimated that there were absolutely more than 100 million children who had never had an opportunity to go to school at all, a focus on access and making sure that at least there was access to education was a critical thing to do. So much of the energy around education was around reducing school fees and looking for other ways to incentivize children to go to school. And that's good, except that the problem was, assuming they even went to school, was anything going on in school. And so, again, even the Millennium Development Goal is a very access-focused goal. It's access to and completion of primary school. At least that was a movement forward from the earliest days in thinking about education and development, which was only access. This was at least access and completion of primary school, but it didn't say you had to complete it and be able to read or know something. I don't mean to be facetious, but there wasn't an attention to. And I think the good news is that in recent years, well, there's a lot of good news and there's still a lot of bad news. The good news is actually there's been significant movement in the area of education. So much so sometimes that I think that people really forget education, and education has tended to fall off the global the center of the global agenda. I mean, it's not the hot topic these days. Maternal and child health, food security, climate, all of which are very important issues. And education, everybody's for it, but it's really boring and it doesn't happen overnight, and you can't take a picture of jabbing a kid and saying that kid won't die from measles, or you can't hand the kid the bed, or an adult a bed net, a pregnant woman a bed net, and say, thank goodness, and we're going to stamp out malaria. What are you going to take a picture of? Paying a teacher? I mean, it's, you can't jab a kid and say, the kid's educated. It's a longer term. And in fact, it gets boring sometimes. It's as important it is it gets boring, because education people sometimes can be boring. They are the only people in the world who engage in advocacy and still use footnotes on all their advocacy. But the good news is there actually has been significant improvement in at least attendance due to lots of things. So for that goal that has been the global goal of access to and completion of primary school, with more than 100 million children out of school in 2000, the latest figures, and they're a couple of years out of date, even with population growth, says that that's been cut by half, about half. Still estimated there are about 67 million children out of school, but again, those are a couple of year late information. And in a good number of countries around the world, that Millennium Development Goal actually will be achieved, that the access to and completion of primary school. The continuing challenges are many, however. It's estimated, for example, that about 40% of that 67 million, and I'll use that figure because it's the official figure. Nobody's out there actually with a little counter, but using that 67 million. It's estimated that about 40% of that 67 million of children are in what are considered in conflict, post-conflict, fragile states, humanitarian emergency situations. And so And so while there's been significant advance, clearly the challenges remain, and in fact the hardest to reach are still the hardest to reach. Still children who are marginalized in various ways, whether they are disabled, whether they are children in indigenous communities who even if they have the opportunity to have access to school, may come and not even be able to engage in whatever the language is that primary school is being taught in. Children in rural areas. So you're most difficult to reach, starting first and foremost with children in conflict areas. So as difficult as it has been to achieve the success so far of at least getting children into school, the remaining 67 million, if you can use those numbers, will even be harder to reach because even in the poorest countries, there may be at least some functioning education system. In your conflict states today, particularly given the increasing face of conflict in the world today, which is not between two nation states, but largely internal to countries, and many multi-stake engagers in conflict, the whole systems are destroyed, and it's just much harder to reach children and seldom have any kind of functioning education systems. Another piece of good news is the gap between boys and girls attending school has also closed quite dramatically in primary school. But it still remains very significant in terms of transition to secondary school. And the third good news, in my view, is there's now starting to be, I don't mean just now, but just really in the last year or so, more attention to not only access, but to quality. Are children learning anything? And how do you begin to measure that? For the Global Partnership, we are focusing on that. Not that this is the only thing, but we're particularly paying attention to efforts to support education plans that are focused on really engaging in strategies that will support children reading in the early years. Literacy, if you will. We don't think it stops at literacy. Clearly, numeracy is very important as well. But if you're going to use an indicator, one good indicator would be not only that the child is enrolled in school, but the child is actually starting to learn and starting to be able to read. And so we're putting a lot of attention. When I say we don't run a separate program. We support, as I said, the education plans in countries, and we support the bringing together all the actors in support of the education plans and trying to improve those plans, but now with more attention not only to access, but to quality, and that quality anchored in reading in the early years. I think that's actually the direction that we will see in thinking about development goals and what will be the picture of the global development approach post-2015, if I can, not as though something stops literally in December 31st in 2015, but as we are thinking about the post-MDGs and post-2015, I think, in fact, you'll see much more attention in education to these issues of quality, to the issues around early childhood development, recognizing that if there's attention even, and in my view, early childhood starts in the mother's womb, actually. It isn't just pre-kindergarten, it really is those earliest years. More attention to early childhood development, because with that attention, then the possibility of children being able to learn when they actually enter into primary school is much greater. So I think post-2015, there'll be much more attention to early childhood, to numeracy and literacy. There'll be more attention to actually trying to have some real information. We make a lot of decisions in development without good information. Very often not data-driven decisions, but just decisions that we hope have some basis. And so much more attention to actually the metrics and measuring and trying to determine what the results are. It's not good enough just to say that we've bought X number of textbooks or built X number of classrooms or trained X number of teachers. First of all, it's not clear what the training has involved in the first place, but what is the result of that? So I think there's going to be much more attention to learning, a learning agenda, some more measuring of outcome and what's actually happening in education rather than just the factor of access to education at this point. So maybe I'll stop right now and take some questions or some issues, if there are issues people want to raise, and that maybe something I should have talked about. I can talk more about what we're doing in the global partnership, but maybe give an opportunity for some people to raise some issues.
Okay, well listen, thank you very much indeed for that.